Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Eleonora Mattiacci. Today I'm here with Lisa Langdon Koch, author of the book, Nuclear Decisions, Changing the Course of Nuclear Weapons Programs. The book was published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
So I am an associate professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. I specialize in international relations, in particular in international security and foreign policy. And my research interests revolve around nuclear proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear restraint, and the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons in conflict, which is a possibility I certainly hope will never become a reality.
Indeed, indeed. Why did you decide to write this book?
I had been interested ever since I was a teenager in the role that nuclear weapons play in shaping international relations. And when I wound up having the good fortune to pursue a PhD at the University of Michigan, and I was thinking about what I would want to write the dissertation on, I kept circling back to nuclear weapons, to this area. And at the same moment that I was making that decision, there was a new group of junior scholars who was working in the same area. So I felt this was promising in terms of finding an intellectual community to become a part of. And I just strongly felt, and I feel that it's a very important topic to understand, given how important deterrence has been and how devastating a nuclear conflict could be. So this particular book grew out of that work, out of the ideas I developed during the dissertation research, and especially as I was researching the case histories of nuclear weapons development in different countries, I kept noticing that there appeared to be many different factors at play beyond security. Security is obviously a very important driver of nuclear weapons development, but it did not seem to be enough to explain the way that different countries pursued nuclear weapons or stopped pursuing nuclear weapons. It didn't seem to be enough to explain what was happening in the real world in these programs. And I wanted to try to add more to how we understood what else matters and when it matters.
That is great. Those case histories are very much present in the book. They're we will get to talk about them later on. Tell us, what's your argument in the book?
I argue that for decades, countries have pursued nuclear weapons by taking many paths toward or away from the bomb. Those paths look different, and they have been difficult for us to predict because they are not simply defined by security or defined by wealth. If those were the answers, we would have been able to determine how each country would go about pursuing nuclear weapons. And we would have been able to predict which country would succeed or fail. And then there would be no puzzle to try to solve. So instead, I argue that we should think about these paths toward or away from the bomb as being shaped by or defined by decisions that leaders make to speed up or slow down their nuclear weapons programs. And I argue that leaders make multiple decisions over multiple years, in many cases over decades. And whether a country ever reaches that final threshold, whether they ever acquire nuclear weapons, depends on these nuclear decisions. So if you think that's an interesting idea, then the next thing you'd want to know is who makes those decisions and how and why. So in the book, I argue that these decisions are political decisions because acquiring nuclear weapons really redefines where a country sits in the international system and their relationships with other countries. So since these are high-level state interests, it shouldn't surprise us that decisions about nuclear weapons programs are made at the highest levels of government. So they're political decisions, and leaders are making these decisions in a complex political information environment. It really shapes and affects how they understand security concerns and how they understand the value of a nuclear weapons program to their country, or the dangers of a nuclear weapons program to their country. So leaders have to really weigh the security benefits the country could gain from nuclear weapons against the drawbacks, like resource limitations, like damage to their international relationships, like the possibility that they will spend billions of dollars on something that might not succeed in the end. So the argument really revolves around this idea that if leaders are the ones who make these decisions, we would want to understand how they make them and where they get the information, who they're talking to, because almost to a person, country leaders do not know much about nuclear weapons, and they learn on the job. So who are they learning from, and what is the timing? When in time, when in history are they making these decisions?
Yes. You're right. Like, these are we do want to know how these decisions are made. I'm quite persuaded. What kind of evidence do you use to support your argument?
Well, this was one of the most fun parts of researching this book. I wound up selecting 9 historical cases to examine in detail. And those are France, the Soviet Union, Israel, South Korea, Sweden, India, Pakistan, Brazil, and South Africa. But I actually spent a long time first conducting case research on the entire population of nuclear weapons pursuers. So I mean by that, any country that we know had started a nuclear weapons program or explored the option of nuclear weapons, even if they never made the political decision to cross the threshold to a weapons program. And people can disagree about exactly which countries belong in that group, but overall, we could say there are around 24 in total. And that case research appears in the appendix. It's a resource for researchers. I identify nuclear decisions across that entire population of states. But then those 9 cases that I wanted to examine in detail in the book, I used primary sources and secondary sources. I read histories others had written. I used government documents whenever possible. But I do want to note it's important to understand that all of us working in this area face a very serious limitation, and that is the limitation of secrecy, because governments so strictly protect nuclear secrets. We know there is a lot we don't know, so we have to proceed carefully and draw cautious conclusions. So I was grateful to receive help from scholars who speak languages I don't, like Portuguese and Swedish, to help me understand specific terms or colloquial phrases in government documents that would help me better puzzle out what the reasoning was, who was making a decision, because there's only so much available to us, and you have to work with the documents that are available.
That's very well said. Very well said. How's the book? So you tell us about these 9 cases, but how's the book organized?
There are 8 chapters. The first introduces the puzzle and main argument of the book and lets the reader know what's coming up. And I think readers should read that short introduction chapter on its own, and then readers can decide for themselves what else in the book might interest them. The second chapter introduces what I call proliferation curves. And the curves are drawings that illustrate that no two countries appear to have taken the same path toward or away from nuclear weapons. And they show that progress toward the bomb is not often linear. So that chapter sets out this puzzle that should pique our interest. If nuclear weapons guarantee security, and that is all there is to understanding nuclear proliferation, why wouldn't states follow a steady path to obtaining the weapons? So with that question in mind, the third chapter is the theory chapter. So for those interested in diving into the theory and the mechanisms at work, that's the chapter they'll want to read carefully. And then just before we get to the case studies, I offer a fourth chapter that examines the history of the nuclear age in terms of what I call proliferation eras, which I'm happy to discuss further. And I actually assign that chapter in a seminar I teach because it provides a guide to factors that shaped the international relations of nuclear weapons starting from the beginning of the nuclear age in the late 1930s. And then the next three chapters are filled with country case studies, 3 countries in each chapter. And last, after I examine the nuclear decisions in each of those countries, I offer a concluding chapter, and I offer thoughts on in particular, I offer thoughts on the Iranian nuclear program, which is a subject of such interest and concern. And I offer my thoughts on what program outsiders would want to know, like myself. What would I want to know about the Iranian nuclear weapons program to be able to assess decision-making in Iran and to try to think about what possibilities might remain to slow progress toward a nuclear arsenal there?
It is a great segue to my next question, which is what conclusions do you reach in the book?
Yeah, so what I find is that nuclear decisions do shape nuclear weapons programs. And I find that the variation we see in how different countries have pursued nuclear weapons development in different time periods cannot just be explained by their security environments or by the type of leader running the country or by the type of regime, democracy, autocracy, or by wealth. Instead, I find that experts can influence country leaders under the right conditions. And if experts can shape a leader's beliefs about the value of a nuclear weapons program, say that it's highly desirable and that it will be easy to develop and build the weapons, or on the other side, that the country doesn't need nuclear weapons, that it will be too expensive, it will be difficult, maybe that it will actually hurt the security of the country by inviting preventive attacks or by damaging foreign relations, then either way, those experts can really limit the set of options the leader has to choose from in the first place. And that's power. So I also find that the constraints or freedoms of international politics in different time periods affect this decision-making. But even those external structural changes and those external politics and norm development, it still gets interpreted through a domestic political environment where leaders are either consulting with experts or not consulting with experts. So the finding ultimately is that those decisions are political and that they are shaped at the micro level in many different ways, depending on who's available to the leader and who's not.
Wow, fascinating. I want to go back to something you mentioned just a few moments ago. You talked to us in the book about proliferation eras. which is a very interesting way to think about proliferation. You theorize these eras in chapter 3, as you were mentioning earlier, and then you structure the remaining empirical chapters through those eras. So tell us more about those eras. What do they look like? First question. And how did you come to realize that they were an important tool to think about proliferation?
So I'll answer the second part first, and then I'll tell more about the eras. I think it occurred to me that they were so important as I was researching the different case histories of the different countries. It just seemed that there were patterns of behavior, and that one explanation for why patterns of behavior were different was that these leaders are making these decisions in different time periods. And it wasn't just that, well, the 1950s are different from the 1970s. It was also that they had to think about different international consequences, or different consequences that the international system was imposing on their programs, depending on when they started, what kind of freedoms they had or constraints they faced really were time dependent. So I started from there thinking about, so what were the major turning points? When did things change to the extent that it would make a difference for leaders when they were trying to decide what to do next? And so I identified 3 events that established different time periods. So the first event is really the start of the nuclear weapons age. And so Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and then the Soviet Union were all engaged in nuclear weapons development in the early to mid 1940s. And of course, we know that in the summer of 1945, the American nuclear test of July 16th, the Trinity test, succeeded. And that shortly after that, the first atomic bombs were used by the U.S. military to attack cities. First, the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6th, and then the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9th, local time. So once that event, the start of the nuclear age, shocks the system, that leads to almost 20 years where there were almost no international constraints on nuclear weapons pursuit. And that sounds strange to us today, because today we are so familiar with this complex regime, this complex non-proliferation regime, this set of rules and norms and international laws and inspections. And none of that was in place in those early years. So I call that period that starts at the beginning of nuclear weapons development and lasts almost 20 years, I call that the permissive period. Permissive because countries were pretty free to do what they wanted to do as long as they had the resources. So the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, they each succeeded in those years in their pursuit of nuclear weapons. And then the second shock comes, which is the successful Chinese nuclear test in October 1964. So that shock ends this permissive period, I argue, because it brings the United States and the Soviet Union closer together, because they are worried that other countries might respond to China's nuclear test. Countries like Japan, like India, they're worried that other countries are going to respond by starting their own nuclear weapons program. And this is going to dilute the monopoly that the nuclear weapons powers have. and it is going to destabilize, they fear, the international system. So China's test really heightens American and Soviet fears, and those are the key players that need to be in alignment to make any sort of international treaty have real weight in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. And it comes just after the United States and Soviet Union had finally been able to cooperate enough to create the Partial Test Ban Treaty. It had taken 8 years of on and off negotiations, stop and start. Finally, the United States and Soviet Union had aligned enough to be able to get that treaty through. And so now China's test really generates this new political will to do more. So it was all still complicated. There were still competing priorities for both of those important players that had to be sorted out, such as U.S. commitments to West Germany that were competing with Soviet interests. So there was still, it's not like the Chinese nuclear test erased all of the problems, but these main players ultimately decided the higher priority had to be preventing more states from going down the path of nuclear weapons. And so the treaty that then arose from the talks that started and that the Soviet Union agreed to join, the treaty that arose, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we call that the NPT because Non-Proliferation Treaty is so hard to say.
It is.
That treaty entered into force in 1970. So it opened for signature in 1968. It entered into force in 1970. And it's widely considered to be one of the most successful international treaties in history. But the big changes that scholars believe have made such a big difference in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, such as the development of a robust inspection and verification system, were not put in place immediately in 1970. They really weren't put in place until after the third event I identify, the third shock to the international system. And that's India's peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. And that nuclear test was a surprise to many countries. It wasn't expected. It was considered an intelligence failure by the United States that they missed it. And that nuclear test used plutonium, which had been produced from a research reactor that had been built in India with Canadian assistance and which used heavy water from the United States. Heavy water moderates the reaction. So it could not have been any clearer that safeguards on nuclear materials and equipment were ineffective, that they were weak, that inspections were not in place, that were doing their job to identify when a country that promised not to develop nuclear weapons had chosen to develop nuclear weapons. So that Indian test, again, generated new political will. And that political will brought the main nuclear exporters together. Before the end of the year, the 7 main nuclear exporters met. The United States, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, West Germany, Japan, Canada, France. They met, they agreed on a list of nuclear material and equipment that would be controlled, meaning if any other country wanted to buy something that was on that list, those 7 countries agreed they would refuse to sell that material or equipment unless the buying country agreed to safeguards that would be put in place to make sure that none of that material or equipment was diverted into a weapons program. And so this is really just the start of a deeper and more effective non-proliferation regime that continued to evolve over time. It continues to evolve today. And I call that the non-proliferation period because it has, ever since 74, we have seen serious constraints on countries that want to develop nuclear weapons.
And I want to go back for a second. You mentioned at the beginning of the third era that India's peaceful nuclear explosion. Where does that expression come from?
So it used to be that countries were entertaining the notion that nuclear weapons might be able to be used for something other than war. And there were a lot of different ideas, such as it would help countries in mining activities, or if you needed to blow up a big area of material that's very difficult to excavate because you wanted to build there. So a peaceful nuclear explosion is the phrase for a nuclear explosion that is not intended to cause destruction to an enemy, but that is intended to destroy something in your own country in order to remove material so that you can mine or so that you can build. And so India termed it a peaceful nuclear explosion. But it was, in reality, this is all just a matter of semantics. It's still a nuclear bomb. And so India called it a peaceful nuclear explosion and said to try to signal we're not building an arsenal, because they weren't. That decision came years later, more than a decade later. But of course, the world recognized that you can put any name on it you want. It still means that your country has the ability to build nuclear bombs. So that's the origin of that special phrase. And countries still use that phrase if they're trying to claim that they're developing nuclear bombs, but not to use in war.
Thank you for clarifying for us. So at a certain point in the book, you write, quotes, the awe, the fear, and the intimidation that politicians experience when it comes to nuclear matters afford unique informational advantages to the masters of nuclear science and to the organizations that house them. Secrecy and technical opacity contribute to the potential influence the organizations have over policy making. End quote. Anything unchecked always sounds a bit painless. Is there an antidote to this feeling, to what you call these feelings of awe, fear, and intimidation?
So that is how I feel as well. Anything unchecked sounds potentially dangerous to me. So, and this is something I think a lot about. What would an antidote be to the feelings of awe and fear and intimidation that we naturally feel when we think about nuclear weapons and what they can do? And I think that one antidote to that would literally be learning about nuclear weapons in terms of how they are built and what effects they have. And I don't mean having to take coursework on the subject, but I think that simple scientific explanations can be given to an audience that is not a technical audience. Just simple explanations of why are nuclear weapons so powerful? What is a fission bomb? What is a fusion bomb? Why do they have different magnitudes of power? How much more powerful are they than non-nuclear weapons? And this is something I spend time with my students on, because what I usually encounter is that students will say, yes, nuclear weapons are more powerful, but they're not that much more powerful than our biggest bombs. And I say, actually, that's not true at all. They're much more powerful than our biggest bombs. In fact, they're so much more powerful than the biggest conventional bombs that our human brains have a very difficult time trying to understand relatively how much bigger they are. And so I think just a bit of understanding to demystify how nuclear bombs work, and then to make concrete instead of abstract, to make concrete the understanding of what do they do. If a nuclear bomb is detonated, what happens next? Why are the effects different from the effects of a conventional bomb, and in what ways? And I think that we see historically, when leaders have learned more about the effects nuclear weapons have on human beings, not including terrible death counts, but also longer term effects, since nuclear weapons have effects that last well beyond the end of a battle. Radiation being just one of these effects that lingers past the end of a war. We've seen throughout history that when leaders receive more concrete information about what will happen next, they become afraid. They become afraid of the power of the weapons. And that's better than being afraid of the idea of the weapons, or afraid of asking questions about the weapons, because we see that too. We see leaders not knowing what questions to ask, and we see leaders accepting whatever their nuclear experts, whether they're in scientific organizations or the military organization, we see leaders just accepting what their experts are telling them because they are too overwhelmed and too intimidated to even know where to start. So simple, basic understandings of how the weapons work and what the effects can be, I think, go a long way toward empowering somebody to feel able to engage in conversations, to be able to push back against information they're receiving. I think that something that's so huge and overwhelming and hard to understand can always be made more concrete and less abstract. So I think for all citizens, this is something that I think is important. I do my very, very small part with my students to educate them on this, because I want them to go out into the world feeling confident that they can engage in these conversations and that they have the background to understand what they are talking about. And I think that a more informed citizenry is very important in this area.